children in the series Where Are They Now? Today we're talking to Rebecca, who's joining us from Delft. Hi.
Hello.
So why don't you start us off and tell us a little bit about yourself, a short introduction, and we'll go from there.
Yes, my name is Rebecca. I'm British Jamaican, and I grew up in Egypt, Italy, Germany, Brunei, and the Netherlands. I'm currently studying urbanism now, and I can really see, I told Emily before, but I can really see how sort of all of my loves of geography, art, people, language, um, they all come together, design, they all come together in what I'm studying now, which has largely been a result of the upbringing that I've had.
Hmm.
So yeah, I'm incredibly grateful for it.
So cool. So you really feel like your upbringing influenced your choice of study and this path that you've taken.
Most definitely, most definitely. Especially like in terms of urbanism, urban planning, urban design.
Hmm.
I take a very much a sociological approach, and I think that has largely been influenced by how I grew up and the different types of people that I've met along the way. Um, so yeah, definitely, it's definitely a reflection of that.
I feel like it always will play a role in your choice of studies for sure, especially like children who grew up as expats, like traveling and such. Really, just yeah. Well, when did you start? Like, what age did you start living abroad? And I'm gonna say it like that quite loosely. Yeah, living your expat life, really.
hmm We left London when I was 2, and
Okay.
then ever since then, and yeah, I see myself living in other parts of the world and exploring other parts of the world. So yeah, since I was 2,
Yeah.
um, we frequently went back to the UK, like for Christmas and for the summer holidays. And so for a large part of my life, especially my grandparents' house, that was the base. And so I always had this sort of reference point to go back to.
Mm.
After my granddad died, though, everything changed, and that's when, for example, the Netherlands became my base.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Interesting. I'm sorry. I see myself in you so much because I also started my like living abroad when I was 2, and then we kept going back to Germany to visit my family, like my grandparents, and that was my base. Uh,
Mhm.
so I think it. I don't know. How do you feel like about that idea? Like that. What was home for you? Was home like the places that you went to, or was home the base that you went back to? You know, summer holidays, Christmas, to see family. What do you think?
Well, now, so I think when I was younger, say when I was 10, home was definitely my grandparents' house because it was the constant. I mean, it was the first place I ever went after the hospital when I was born. So it was always very much the constant in my life. And then I think after Granddad died, home and then it got me thinking and reflecting, and especially now that I'm like a young adult, um I think that I see home is sort of familiarity
Mm.
with certain places. So in Italy, we go back there occasionally, and there I especially to where we lived, I feel like a strong connection to it and like a deep love and affection for it. I haven't been back to Egypt since we left, but I also feel incredibly attached. I remember after we left, it was one of my first heartbreaks. It took me like 3 years to not hear Egypt and want to cry. um, so I think yeah, I've noticed that home is multiple, and it's not necessarily a specific place, but it's largely like a feeling of safety,
Mm.
and community, and yeah, sort of peace. And I found that in many different places. I wouldn't maybe I wouldn't describe it as home, but I felt such love and being so welcomed. I visited a friend in Montenegro a few years ago just for a holiday, and I felt so embraced. So I realized I read this poem a few years ago, and it reads like, nowhere it feels like home because I find myself everywhere, and I really do feel like that. I grow. That's why I'm also, after the Netherlands, I'll probably live somewhere else and find out more about myself and the home that I kind of create within me. So yeah, home is multiple now. It's
That's really
multifaceted.
cool. That's really cool. So what kind of schools did you attend? This one interests me just as a personal um, yeah,
Mhm.
it's a personal thing. What did you attend like American schools, French schools, uh,
Mhm.
abroad?
So a mixture of like British international schools and then also international schools like the IB International
Yeah,
Baccalaureate schools.
yeah.
And so it was a sort of a flip-flop between the two. In my later years, though, it was IB
Hmm.
in Amsterdam, and yeah, so I was mainly in British international and sort
Right.
of international baccalaureate schools.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And so you must have met a lot of people that sort of were in the same boat as you, traveling with their families, changing schools, meeting new friends every other year or so.
Yeah, no, definitely. Like I was reflecting on this a few years ago and thinking about the different people in the different places. I was thinking actually about how well, no, I won't go into that. But about the different people in the different places, and so there were lots of children whose parents worked for oil companies or children of diplomats, or other sort of big um, multinational corporations. And yeah, they were sort of in and out. But I remember because we sometimes lived in places for 2 years, and I remember especially children of diplomats, they seemed to live in places for 3 to 4 years, and so they had
Longer.
like good periods of
Yeah.
time,
Yeah.
longer periods of time, being 3 years or 4 years. Um,
Long.
um, but yeah, so we were definitely in and out. And then in Brunei, um, that like Brunei was, for such a tiny country, our school was incredibly international and also colorful, um, which I say as a person of color, as a black um, person who go sort of went to several international schools, that it was so nice to be in an environment that reflected like the different colors and complexions and cultures and histories of the world. Because I found that quite interesting, sort of in one of my schools where they said it was really international, but then, and it was international within Europe or within the North America, like it was international, but not very colorful at all. And so I think like I'm very grateful for my schools in Egypt and Brunei for sort of better reflecting that
Yeah.
type of international um yeah sort of international sort of people and cultures, so that I as a student could see myself reflected also in the classroom and the school itself, and didn't feel like I had to be an ambassador.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So if you'd like, do you mind like if we go into that a little bit, maybe? Growing up as a person of color internationally, so abroad, and go into yeah, that how was that experience for you? How has that how were you did you feel let's say yeah, represented within the international system in countries like not Brunei or Egypt, but Germany, Italy, uh,
Mm-hmm.
the
Mm-hmm.
Netherlands? How
Um, so in Germany, to be honest, I don't remember very much. I was quite young at the time.
okay, yeah.
But
That's
we had also left Italy, and I was devastated to leave Italy, so I wasn't very happy about where we were at the time, just because yeah, Italy, I loved it entirely and fully. Um, uh, so the one of the first things that comes to mind in terms of living in, especially in Italy, and then going back to my family as well in London, um, being a British Jamaican, and then also in Egypt and Brunei, was I remember that as a child, and not necessarily that in these different places that there were only British Jamaicans or Italians or Egyptians or Bruneians, but there was like a wide mixture of people. Um, is that like now I feel like I've been loved by so many different types of people, and so um yeah, I find it not easy. Well, yeah, I'm sort of open to loving many different types of people as well, because as a child I was so nourished by all of these different places of love. Um, so I think that was really precious. I think in terms of, and as a child I didn't see it as much, and it was only something that I started to reflect on really in my teens, and then yeah, sort of later on as I grew up. But in Italy, I think I was the only person of color, but it was also a very small school. And then in Egypt, it became a lot more colorful, but then outside the school gates as well, my mom was very keen on sort of becoming more embedded into the local culture and community. And so we also spent a lot of time with Egyptians as well as Sudanese people. So I think, like in that sense, I could also see myself reflected always. In Brunei, it was slightly different. It was still quite colourful, and uh, but that's when I started to see sort of a racial hierarchy sort of forming. And then as we moved to Amsterdam, that became incredibly apparent for me. And I say this not only, I think that international schools, I mean, how they even started, is sort of, it relates to sort of these colonial systems of, like if we really sort of deeply reflect, I think we can see lots of familiarities, or we can really see how it is like a child and a legacy of colonialism, in the present day. And I think you can see that in the classroom um, culture, in terms of what books we read in school. I mean, we learned about racism by reading To Kill a Mockingbird, and
Same. Yeah, yeah,
it's a wonderful book, but I find it, that was the first book for a group of students who are largely white
yeah.
to learn about racism, where there are several black voices. I mean, you have James Baldwin, you have so many different people, people of color, to learn about. So I think you can. That's when I started to really sort of struggle um, with sort of international schools and this philosophy that they were, not philosophy, but sort of culture, and that they were pushing, that they didn't really feel very embracing of other cultures. Actually, it was very Western centric, upon reflection. But I am incredibly grateful for the education that they've given me. But I think, yeah, there's a lot to do in terms of improving diversity, equity, and inclusion in those spaces.
Absolutely. I completely agree. Where did you
Yeah.
live in Italy, just out of curiosity?
In Como.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
And do you speak
Yeah.
any Italian?
So when I was younger, I was fluent, and then when we left, I was so angry. I was like, I'm not speaking it anymore then. Um, yeah.
Where did you live the longest?
The Netherlands. I've lived here for 11 years. Actually, this is the first time I've ever lived in a place for sort of so I've lived in Egypt technically for 6 years, but they weren't 6 consecutive years. So it's also the first time I've ever lived in a place for an extended period of time, sort of
Right.
after year.
So, okay, 11. Wow. So
Yeah.
are you ready to leave to go explore some more when you're done with your studies?
So I'm going to be in the Netherlands for a little bit longer, and then yeah, I'm very curious as to um what it's like to be in and experience other parts of the world. Definitely,
Yeah.
definitely. I'm I'm very excited for that. And maybe I should have said before. So um sort of after school, I spent considerable amounts of times in South Africa and Kenya, and this leads back onto our previous point about um, international schools, and sort of how colourful they are, and how sort of prepared they are to sort of reckon with um, the past, especially colonial past.
Yeah.
But I was in South Africa for a very significant period of time for me. I'm not necessarily talking about length, but I'm talking about just depth of experience. And for me, it was one of the first times that I was in like a majority black country, and so to see myself reflected, and also in a very sort of yeah, complex society in terms of race, but it was the first time I saw like billboards with Black women looking beautiful and sort of being celebrated. It's very multifaceted, and I'm sort of simplifying a very complex story. But it was for me one of the first times that I could see myself reflected and see myself and see sort of a major part of me that I didn't see in sort of the end of my international school journey, that I found there. And honestly, yeah, it was also a very significant experience for me.
I
Yeah.
can imagine. I mean, it must have felt like, I don't know, like what's the word I'm looking for? The only word coming to mind is like full circle, but I don't know. It must have felt very different. Must have felt quite refreshing as well, maybe. Just yeah, seeing this for the, I don't know, for not maybe the first time, but
It was definitely refreshing. And like I said, like we always went back to London, especially when we lived in Amsterdam. It was a lot closer, so we went back to the UK quite a lot. And I was telling somebody this, and I was like, yeah, and and when I go back to London, it's incredibly colourful, and I'm around a lot of Black people, and they were like, what, in London? Like, you know nothing. Because there are sort of countries with majority Black populations where it's so much more. Um, but no, it was incredibly enriching for me, especially where yeah, I just finished school, so I was 18, and yeah, I'm incredibly grateful for South Africa, especially like and relating to you said, what I am I thinking about leaving the Netherlands sometime, and definitely I don't know if it would be to South Africa, but it would be to other parts of the world that I don't know anything about. I think the unfamiliarity really appeals to me, but also I think, and this is something that my mum's consistently said since growing up, is that you can learn um anywhere, and so I'm and also to embrace the discomfort, and I don't mean not having any safety, but sort of discomfort within safety, and so I'm so excited to explore what that's like in other geographies and other cultures with different people, different languages. I love languages. So and I'm not just talking about sort of verbal languages, but also um body languages and sort of emotive languages, and also food languages. I was listening to previous expat click interviews, and one girl was talking about how yeah, food is really universal, and this is something that struck me in Kenya when we were eating like traditional Swahili cuisine where it's all on one single platter. And I was like, oh my gosh, talk about like community, and like you're literally eating from the same plate. And I was like, whoa. And then we started to eat more like Ethiopian food, and I was like, oh my gosh, like amazing. This is a different language of eating and sharing and
yeah.
being
Yeah.
together. Yeah.
Right now, honestly, I would love to see all the places I lived in. So, not just
Mm,
Sudan, but we lived in Pakistan for about almost 4 years when I was a kid. And
mhm,
my aunt actually yesterday asked me, like, do you remember Pakistan? And I said, well, I remember it through rose-colored glasses, very romantically because I was a kid.
mhm,
I went to kindergarten. I had my friends. I had my parents. So I don't know much about it as an adult,
mhm,
but I would love to go back. I would love to see it. I would love to see the
mhm.
mountains, the northern areas, and I'd love to go there maybe one day.
Mhm, mhm, mhm.
Yeah.
This is really interesting. I've also I've I've thought about this a lot as well, sort of going back to where we used to live,
Yeah.
and we've been back to Italy, and recently we went back to Berlin.
Oh,
And I was like, I will live here. I say this a lot, or not a lot actually, but there have been many cities that I've been to and been like, yes, I will live here one day again. But we went back to Berlin, and it was also like, as I said, we had just left Italy, and I wasn't very happy about that move. um, um, but um, but going back to Berlin, and I went back with my mom as well, and so it was quite like a beautiful experience to also experience it as an adult. And I think what you said about rose-colored glasses, I think that I may have that in regards to Egypt. And like I'm like, oh, I don't know if I want to go back there because then it will be shattered. I'm like, okay. Um, with it being as it is now. But also I'm interested in it becoming sort of a more full story, a more complex story as well. Because yeah, the love in my heart is deep. So yeah.
I completely agree. I think it's like I call it a need for closure, but it doesn't necessarily have to be closure. I would just like to go to these places and just kind of close the circle. So I've seen it as a child. I have my childhood memories, but going there as an adult and seeing it differently and seeing the places that you used to see all the time and approach
Mhm,
it through different eyes. So
mhm,
we went to Macedonia with my friend that I met there, and
mhm,
we remembered Skopje, the capital, through rose-colored
mhm,
glasses, and we remembered things a lot bigger and a lot like
mhm,
beautiful and stuff. And we went there, and we were a little bit disappointed, um,
mhm,
but it was still like wow. We saw these things. We walked into this mall where we used to hang out as children with our families, and we were like, we swore this used to be bigger, but it wasn't.
mhm.
We were just smaller, and
Yeah.
but it's come full circle now because we saw it as kids as like this beautiful magical place, and now we saw it as young adults, and it's different. It's not
Yeah.
bad. It just feels like
Mhm,
feels completed in a way.
mhm. Yeah, yeah.
Really get it.
For a long time, I had this kind of love-hate relationship with London, and the since Grandad died, and since for the past like 2 years, every time I've gone back, like I'm like, ah, it is like this, and I can accept it in its messiness, as I am also messy, and I can see the beauty of it, and that's been really, really nice as well to be like, yeah, to like accept it in its new form and its new state. And I find what you said really interesting about when you went back to Skopje and you remember everything as being bigger, and it's like a literal sort of yeah example of how your perspective literally changed because you were no longer on sort of smaller and seeing it from that lens, but yeah, and all of the other perspectives and how they've evolved over time. It's quite beautiful. Yeah. Yeah.
It's something you can't really describe to someone who hasn't experienced it. I don't know. Someone who hasn't grown up living abroad and stuff, it's just like it's hard to explain, So it's hard to talk about sometimes. I find, at least. I don't know about you, but it's just like, how do you explain these things? How do you explain these feelings?
Yeah. I think now it was incredibly interesting actually. So I chose to do a Dutch degree course in university, and that was the first time that I was then in a more sort of culturally homogenous environment. And I was like, what? Wait, you're from Leiden and you're from The Hague, and they're like half an hour from each other by train or by car, or 20 minutes even. And that was the first time I was ever in that environment because I was so used to people being like, oh, I'm from Uzbekistan and I'm from Ghana and I'm from wherever. Um, and like at at first I like now I think that even so I did tend to gravitate towards people who had either lived in multiple countries growing up, or sort of were mixed in terms of nationality, ethnicity, um just because they or we had that sort of similarity of being surrounded by difference, which I could really relate to. But then, and that still was the case when I started uni. But then, as I started to socialize more with people who had grown up in one place and like their family and their grandparents were sort of around the corner, it became more about whether people are curious
Yeah.
um, to hear and to share. And so that's like, I think that's for me like one of the major things, if I can sort of qualities, if I can connect with somebody or not, is whether they're curious also to share their stories and their experiences, and also to hear others. So yeah, for me it's like curiosity, because I've met some beautiful people in the Netherlands, as I've lived here for a long time, who have grown up here, their entire lives, but they're so curious about the world. And then I find it quite actually easy to connect because they're curious and so am I. So yeah, it kind of like peeling off the layers, it becomes about maybe these shared values. And I think curiosity definitely is a value for me now.
I
Yeah.
completely agree. I completely agree. Yeah, couldn't have said it better myself. Um, so sadly, we're running out of time.
Yeah.
Um, so I think we're gonna cut it here. But thanks so much for participating, for doing this interview with me. I've learned so much, and I'm so grateful. And it was really really cool meeting you. I think you've had such an interesting life, and so many more interesting things ahead. I'm just excited for you.
And likewise to you, likewise to you. I sorry, if I can just say one more
Of
thing
course, of
about what you
course.
said about sort of having lived like an interesting life. And like as we're speaking, I thought the same about you. And currently in my thesis, it I won't go into it too much, but essentially I've had to speak to lots of different types of people, and like people are so interesting. It's insane how interesting they are. And I've said this to multiple people, but I've been doing some field work, and over the course of the past month or two, I've fallen in love with like 20 times. Maybe it's not like a super deep love, but I've fallen in love. And because people are so interesting. So yeah. Yeah.
It's so cool. Okay, Becca, thank you so much. It's been lovely. I love meeting you, and best of luck.